The young and the restless spoilers, Victor faces his greatest fear as Nikki's darkness changes everything, but another secret could rewrite Genoa City forever. What if the moment Victor Newman believed he had lost Nikki forever became the very moment that changed their love story forever? What if a wedding ring that had been returned in heartbreak was destined to become the symbol of an even stronger marriage? And while one family desperately fights to save the woman they love, another shocking battle is unfolding behind locked doors, where Diane Jenkins is risking everything to escape before time runs out. But that's only the beginning. A dangerous rescue mission is about to collide with a heartbreaking medical crisis. Old enemies are becoming unexpected allies, family loyalties are being tested, and one emotional decision could permanently reshape the future of the Newman family. Could Nikki's devastating illness finally remind Victor what truly matters? Is a vow renewal really waiting on the other side of tragedy? And will Jack Abbott reach Diane before Patty Williams' deadly manipulation destroys every chance of bringing her home? Let's dive into everything that's unfolding in Genoa City. For years, Victor Newman has built his life around one simple belief: there is no problem that cannot be solved with enough determination, power, or influence. Whenever danger appeared, Victor found a way to overcome it. Whenever his family needed protection, he stood at the front of the battle. But this time, everything is different. This is not a corporate takeover. This is not another Newman versus Abbott war. This is not a rival trying to steal his empire. This is Nikki. And for perhaps the first time in years, Victor is facing a crisis that money cannot erase. Only days ago, the tension between Victor and Nikki had reached a heartbreaking breaking point. Their endless disagreements left both of them emotionally exhausted. Every conversation seemed to end in disappointment, and every attempt to repair their marriage only pushed them farther apart. Then came the moment that nobody expected. Nikki quietly removed her wedding rings and placed them into Victor's hand. There were no dramatic speeches. No screaming. No impossible demands. Just silence. Sometimes silence hurts far more than anger ever could. That single moment told Victor everything he never wanted to hear. The woman who had stood beside him through decades of triumph and tragedy no longer believed their future could be saved. For Nikki, returning those rings wasn't simply ending an argument. It was admitting that she had stopped believing their marriage could survive. Victor watched the woman he loved walk away, believing he had finally lost the greatest love of his life. Then everything changed. Before Victor could even begin processing the collapse of their relationship, an even more terrifying truth emerged. Nikki wasn't pulling away because she no longer loved him. She was carrying an unimaginable burden completely alone. Doctors had discovered a dangerous brain mass, one capable of stealing her eyesight forever. Even surgery offered no guarantees. Success wasn't certain. Recovery wasn't promised. Every hour increased the uncertainty surrounding Nikki's future. Suddenly, every argument seemed meaningless. Every harsh word became a regret. Every missed opportunity to comfort her became another painful memory Victor wished he could erase. Instead of thinking about pride, Victor began thinking about time. How much time did they have left? Would Nikki ever see his face again? Would she ever watch another Newman family gathering? Another sunrise? Another holiday surrounded by the people she loves? Questions like these cannot be answered with power or influence. They can only be faced with love. As Victor struggles with overwhelming guilt, another desperate battle is unfolding across Genoa City. Diane Jenkins remains trapped inside Dr. Laurence Markham's heavily secured home, where every passing minute makes escape even more dangerous. Unlike Nikki, Diane isn't fighting a medical crisis. She's fighting for her freedom. Fortunately, Diane understands something about survival. Sometimes strength doesn't come from force. Sometimes it comes from patience. Instead of confronting Markham directly, Diane begins carefully studying his personality. She notices his need for admiration, his confidence, and his belief that he is always the smartest person in the room. Rather than resisting him, Diane starts encouraging his ego. Every compliment becomes another carefully placed move in a dangerous psychological chess match. She smiles. She listens. She allows him to believe she's beginning to trust him. But behind every word, Diane is planning her escape. She knows she may only receive one opportunity. One mistake could cost her everything. Meanwhile, Jack Abbott has no intention of abandoning the woman he loves. Even though entering Markham's property carries enormous risk, Jack refuses to accept failure. Every instinct tells him Diane is still alive, still fighting, and still waiting for someone to find her before it's too late. Unfortunately, Jack has no idea another dangerous player is quietly changing the rules behind the scenes. Patty Williams has already learned far more than anyone realizes. And once Patty decides to interfere, every rescue plan becomes dramatically more complicated. Just as Victor races to save his marriage. Just as Diane prepares her boldest escape. And just as Jack believes he's getting closer to the truth. Patty is preparing a move that could send every one of those plans crashing down. Because in Genoa City, hope can disappear in a single moment, and the next shocking twist may be closer than anyone imagines. The silence hanging over Genoa City felt heavier than ever. Inside the hospital, Victor Newman stood outside Nikki's room with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The powerful businessman who had spent decades controlling every situation suddenly found himself powerless. No negotiation, no business deal, and no amount of influence could guarantee that Nikki would ever regain her sight. For the first time in a long time, Victor wasn't thinking like the head of the Newman empire. He was simply thinking like a husband. Every memory came rushing back. He remembered the first time Nikki smiled at him, the countless battles they had survived together, the family they had built despite impossible odds, and every promise they had made through the years. Looking back now, none of the recent arguments seemed important anymore. What mattered was whether they would have another chance. When Victor finally entered Nikki's room, he tried to remain strong. Nikki could sense his presence immediately, even without being able to see him. She didn't need her eyesight to recognize the familiar footsteps of the man who had been part of her life for decades. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Sometimes the deepest conversations happen without words. Nikki quietly admitted that losing her vision had changed everything. She confessed that the future frightened her more than she wanted anyone to know. She wasn't afraid of surgery itself. She was afraid of becoming dependent on everyone around her. Most of all, she didn't want Victor sacrificing his own life because of her condition. Victor immediately rejected that idea. He reminded Nikki that marriage had never been about convenience. It had always been about standing together during life's worst moments. If this was the greatest challenge they had ever faced, then they would face it together. Those words reached Nikki in a way that weeks of arguments never could. For the first time since her diagnosis, she allowed herself to believe she wasn't fighting alone. Meanwhile, across town, another dangerous game continued unfolding. Diane Jenkins realized Dr. Laurence Markham was beginning to trust her. Everything she had done over the past several days was carefully calculated. Every compliment, every conversation, every smile had been part of a larger strategy. She understood that forcing an escape would almost certainly fail. Winning Markham's confidence offered a much better chance. The doctor became increasingly convinced that Diane had accepted her situation. That assumption would become his greatest mistake. When Markham briefly stepped away to prepare medication, Diane quietly examined every detail of the room. She studied the locks, counted the security cameras, and memorized every sound coming from the hallway. She wasn't simply waiting anymore. She was preparing. At the same time, Jack Abbott refused to sit still. Despite repeated warnings about the danger surrounding Patty Williams and Dr. Markham, Jack continued searching for any clue that could lead him to Diane. Kyle remained deeply concerned that his father was placing himself directly in harm's way, but Jack made one thing perfectly clear. If Diane was risking her life to survive, then he owed it to her to keep fighting. Neither Jack nor Kyle realized that Patty had already anticipated nearly every move they were making. Listening carefully, watching quietly, Patty stayed several steps ahead of them. She understood exactly how determined Jack was, and she intended to use that determination against him. The rescue mission was slowly becoming a trap. Elsewhere in Genoa City, Jill Abbott found herself growing increasingly frustrated with Billy Abbott and Kane Ashby. Their constant battles had dragged on long enough. Jill reminded both men that personal pride had already cost the family too much. Every disagreement only created new problems while distracting them from what truly mattered. Billy remained convinced that Kane couldn't be trusted. Kane believed Billy would never respect him. Neither man showed any willingness to compromise. Finally, Jill lost her patience. She challenged both of them to stop reliving old grudges and start thinking about the future instead. Whether they liked it or not, they would have to find common ground before even more damage was done. Although Billy and Kane reluctantly agreed to keep the peace, it was obvious their rivalry was far from over. Neither trusted the other. Neither believed the conflict had truly ended. Back at the hospital, Victor quietly opened a small box that he had kept hidden in his pocket since Nikki returned it days earlier. Inside were her wedding rings. He looked down at them for several moments before closing the box again. This wasn't the right time. Not yet. But deep inside, Victor had already made a decision. If Nikki recovered, if they survived this nightmare together, he would ask her to wear those rings again. Not because the past could be erased, but because their future deserved another chance. Neither Victor nor Nikki realized that hope might arrive much sooner than expected. Doctors were beginning to notice small but encouraging signs after Nikki's procedure. Nothing was certain, and no one wanted to raise false expectations. Still, there was enough progress to make everyone wonder whether a miracle was quietly beginning. And if Nikki's recovery continued, Victor's dream of placing those wedding rings back on her finger might finally become reality. But before that dream could come true, another shocking confrontation was about to erupt, one that would place Jack, Diane, Patty, and the entire Abbott family in more danger than ever before. The atmosphere across Genoa City began to shift. For the first time in days, there was something that had been missing from every conversation surrounding Nikki Newman. Hope. The doctors remained cautious, refusing to promise a miracle before they had clear evidence, but the latest examination suggested that Nikki's surgery had gone better than anyone expected. Her recovery would still take time, and no one could predict whether her eyesight would fully return, yet the possibility alone was enough to lift the spirits of the entire Newman family. Victor refused to leave the hospital. Business meetings were cancelled. Phone calls went unanswered. The Newman empire could survive without its CEO for a few days. Victor knew there was only one place he belonged. Every morning he sat beside Nikki's bed, talking to her about everything from old family vacations to the grandchildren who couldn't wait to see her again. He described the sunrise outside her window, the flowers visitors had sent, and even the smallest details that Nikki could no longer see for herself. He hoped that hearing those images would somehow remind her that life was still waiting outside those hospital walls. Nikki smiled more often than she had since receiving her diagnosis. Little by little, the fear that had consumed her began to fade. She realized Victor wasn't staying because he felt guilty. He was staying because he genuinely couldn't imagine a future without her. That realization changed everything. Instead of pushing him away, Nikki finally admitted how terrified she had been. She confessed that returning her wedding rings hadn't been an act of anger, it had been an attempt to protect Victor from the burden of watching her suffer. She believed ending their marriage would make it easier for him to move on if the worst happened. Victor immediately shook his head. He reminded Nikki that love had never been about walking away when life became difficult. Every challenge they had survived together had only strengthened the bond between them. This challenge would be no different. As the conversation grew more emotional, Victor quietly reached into his jacket pocket. He removed the small velvet box once again. Without saying a word, he opened it. Inside rested the wedding rings Nikki had returned only days earlier. Victor gently took her hand. "I never stopped believing these belonged to you," he whispered. Nikki's eyes filled with tears. Although she still couldn't clearly see the rings, she recognized exactly what Victor was doing. She slowly nodded. Victor carefully slipped the rings back onto her finger. There was no audience. No grand celebration. No elaborate ceremony. Only two people quietly renewing the promise they had made to each other so many years ago. Victor promised that no matter what happened next, he would face every challenge beside her. Nikki promised she would never again try to carry life's greatest burdens alone. It wasn't an official vow renewal. But emotionally, it meant even more. At nearly the same time, another emotional battle was reaching its breaking point across town. Diane Jenkins had finally discovered the opportunity she had been waiting for. Dr. Laurence Markham had become completely convinced that Diane trusted him. His confidence continued growing with every conversation they shared. That confidence became his weakness. When Markham briefly left the room after preparing another sedative, Diane acted immediately. She quietly searched his office, looking for anything that could help her escape. Keys. Security codes. A phone. Anything. She quickly discovered documents revealing far more than she expected. Markham hadn't simply been hiding Diane. Someone had been helping finance his operation. Before Diane could study the paperwork any further, footsteps echoed down the hallway. She barely managed to hide the documents before Markham returned. Although he noticed nothing unusual, Diane now understood that this conspiracy was much larger than anyone imagined. Meanwhile, Jack Abbott continued refusing to abandon hope. Kyle worried his father's determination was beginning to cloud his judgment, but Jack believed every passing hour increased Diane's danger. Then an unexpected message arrived. It wasn't enough to reveal Diane's exact location. But it was enough to convince Jack that she was still alive. Without wasting another second, Jack prepared to launch his most dangerous rescue attempt yet. Unfortunately, Patty Williams was already watching events unfold. She smiled as Jack unknowingly walked exactly where she wanted him to go. Every move he made fit perfectly into her plan. Back at Chancellor, Jill Abbott wasn't convinced Billy and Kane had truly buried their differences. Their temporary peace felt forced. She could sense both men were hiding their real intentions. Jill warned them that another personal war would destroy more than their business relationship. It could fracture the entire family at a time when everyone needed unity more than ever. Neither Billy nor Kane argued. But neither looked convinced. As evening settled over Genoa City, Victor remained seated beside Nikki, still holding her hand. Then something happened. Nikki blinked several times. She frowned. A faint blur of light appeared in the darkness. It lasted only a moment. Then another. She couldn't make out faces. She couldn't recognize details. But she could see light. Victor immediately called for the doctors, hardly daring to believe what he had just witnessed. Could this be the first sign that Nikki's vision was returning? Or was it only a temporary step before another heartbreaking setback? As doctors rushed into the room and Jack unknowingly moved closer to Patty's trap, one thing became clear. The next chapter of this story would change the lives of the Newmans and the Abbotts forever, and not everyone would emerge from the coming storm the same person they were before. No one in Genoa City could have predicted how quickly everything would change. Only days earlier, the Newman family had been preparing for the possibility that Nikki Newman might never see the world again. Fear had replaced hope, uncertainty had overshadowed every conversation, and Victor Newman had begun questioning whether he had wasted precious time arguing with the woman he loved instead of appreciating every moment they shared. Now, as doctors continued monitoring Nikki's condition, the atmosphere inside the hospital felt completely different. No one was celebrating yet. It was still too early. But the first signs of improvement had given everyone something they desperately needed, a reason to believe. The medical team explained that recovery after brain surgery could be unpredictable. Some patients experienced immediate improvement, while others recovered gradually over days or even weeks. Nikki's brief ability to detect light didn't guarantee a full recovery, but it proved that hope was still alive. Victor listened carefully to every word. For once, he wasn't searching for guarantees. He simply wanted another chance. Another chance to build new memories. Another chance to correct old mistakes. Another chance to love Nikki the way she deserved to be loved. Later that evening, after the doctors completed another examination, Victor returned to Nikki's bedside carrying a single white rose. He smiled and admitted something he hadn't confessed in years. For too long, he had assumed there would always be another tomorrow. Another anniversary. Another family dinner. Another opportunity to say the things he often kept buried inside. Nikki quietly reached for his hand. She admitted she had made mistakes too. Instead of trusting Victor with her fears, she had tried to face her illness alone. She convinced herself that protecting everyone else meant carrying the burden by herself. Now she understood that real strength wasn't found in isolation. It came from allowing the people who loved her to stand beside her. That realization transformed their relationship. Their marriage wasn't simply surviving. It was beginning again. Victor looked at Nikki and gently suggested that once she fully recovered, they shouldn't focus on everything they had lost. Instead, they should celebrate everything they had found again. Not with an extravagant Newman Enterprises event. Not with endless publicity. Just a quiet ceremony surrounded by the people who mattered most. A simple renewal of the promises that had carried them through decades of triumph, heartbreak, forgiveness, and unconditional love. Nikki smiled. She didn't answer immediately. She simply squeezed Victor's hand and whispered that this time, the promises would carry even deeper meaning because both of them finally understood how close they had come to losing everything. Elsewhere in Genoa City, another emotional reunion seemed closer than ever. Jack Abbott followed every clue he could gather, convinced Diane Jenkins was still fighting to return home. Inside Dr. Laurence Markham's house, Diane continued playing the most dangerous role of her life. She smiled when necessary. She remained calm under pressure. She allowed Markham to believe he controlled every situation. In reality, Diane had already memorized the security routine, identified possible exits, and hidden the evidence she discovered linking Markham to a much larger conspiracy. She only needed one opening. One mistake. One opportunity. Jack unknowingly moved closer with every passing hour. But Patty Williams refused to surrender control. Watching events unfold from the shadows, Patty prepared one final manipulation that could place both Jack and Diane in even greater danger than before. If Jack rushed in too quickly, he could lose everything. If Diane waited too long, she might never escape. Their race against time had officially begun. Across town, Jill Abbott watched Billy Abbott and Kane Ashby from a distance. Although they had agreed to call a temporary truce, Jill recognized the tension that still existed between them. She suspected the conflict wasn't over. In fact, she believed the biggest confrontation had yet to happen. Whatever secret Jill was quietly protecting could eventually force Billy and Kane onto the same side or drive them even farther apart. As Genoa City settled into another restless night, every major family stood at a crossroads. The Newmans had rediscovered hope through love. The Abbotts were preparing for a dangerous rescue mission. Old rivalries remained unresolved. Hidden enemies continued pulling strings from the shadows. And new secrets were only beginning to surface. For Victor and Nikki, the future suddenly looked brighter than it had in weeks. The darkness that once threatened to end their love story had instead reminded them why they fell in love in the first place. Sometimes life's greatest tragedies don't destroy a family. Sometimes they reveal what truly matters. If Nikki's eyesight continues improving, their long-awaited vow renewal could become one of the most emotional moments Genoa City has witnessed in years, a celebration not just of marriage, but of survival, forgiveness, and second chances. But in true the young and the restless fashion, peace never lasts forever. Just when one chapter finally reaches its happy ending, another mystery is already waiting to begin. With Patty's dangerous game still unfolding, Diane's escape hanging by a thread, Billy and Kane's rivalry far from settled, and Nikki's final recovery still uncertain, the biggest surprises may still be ahead. One thing is certain, the next few days won't simply change the lives of Victor and Nikki. They could reshape the future of the entire Newman and Abbott families in ways no one sees coming.